started then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to St. Petersburg. We're glad to see you here. We're glad to be with you in St. Petersburg. It's a nice sunny day. It is 4 o'clock p.m. here. Temperature is about 0 degrees Celsius, which I understand is 32 Fahrenheit. And we're beginning our tour from the heart of the city, from the main square. It is called Palace Square. And today's tour is going to be dedicated to two famous classical Russian writers, Alexander Pushkin and Nikolai Gogol. So we're going to talk about them. Although they lived in St. Petersburg for long periods of life and then rented apartments in different parts of the city, and those places are scattered all over the city. Within such a short time that we have today, we'll be able to see only just a few. I'm sorry about that. So in order to see some other interesting places, you have to come here for a long time. All right, but let's start here in the Palace Square. It is named after the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace is the most famous dwelling palace of the Russian Tsars. It was built in the middle of the 18th century by the Russian Empress Elizabeth, who was probably the most lavish, the most spendthrift Empress of Russia. And she built this beautiful palace. Unfortunately, she never lived in this palace because she died 1 year before it was finished. And the first landlady of this palace was Catherine the Great. Today, the Winter Palace is part of one of the biggest museums in the world, art museums. It's called Hermitage. The Winter Palace and the Hermitage can be visited, of course. It is probably the major or the most important site to visit in St. Petersburg. In the middle of the square is a very impressive column. It was erected when Alexander Pushkin lived in St. Petersburg in 1834, and it is impressive even today, but it was even more impressive back then because this column is absolutely unique. It is made of one solid rock of granite. It weighs 600 tons. It is one solid piece of granite. On the top, there is a statue with an angel, actually, and we call it Alexander column. It is named after the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who reigned Russia during the war against Napoleon. So this column is a kind of a monument to the war against Napoleon. And in 1836, Alexander Pushkin wrote a poem where he mentioned this column. He was very much impressed by it. In 1836, this was the last year of his life, actually, and he summed up a little bit, summed up results of his poetic life, probably, and he wrote a poem. I would like to read it now. Can you show the tree is our moderator? Can you show the slide of the poem? Я памятник, yes, here's Alexander Pushkin. Я памятник себе воздвиг нерукотворный, к нему не зарастет народная тропа, вознесся выше он главою непокорной Александрийского столпа. A monument I've raised, not built with hands. And common folk will keep the path well trodden to where it unsubdued and towering stands higher than Alexander's column. So he compared himself with this column, and he was saying that people will remember about him just like people remember about the victorious war against Napoleon. All right, also here, let's get back to a live picture. Also here is another impressive site of St. Petersburg. We call this huge semi-circular building General Headquarters because it was built as an administrative building. And it is also associated with Alexander Pushkin, especially during the last years of his life. He worked in these buildings because state historical archives were quartered in these buildings. And when Alexander Pushkin was working on his novel, Captain's Daughter, and a book about Peter the Great, so he was allowed by the emperor himself to work in the state archives in this building. In the middle of the building is another impressive view. There is a triumphal arch in the middle, which is also a monument to the Russian victory over Napoleon. On the top, there is a chariot of victory with the Greek goddess of victory, Nike, very impressive statue. So let me remind you again that we are now in the Peter and Paul Fortress. Sorry, we are now in the main square of the city. Sorry, we are now in the main square of the city, Palace Square. It is named after the Winter Palace. Well, if we talk about Alexander Pushkin, so we can certainly say a lot about him. In Russian, we have a popular phrase, Pushkin наше все, which can be translated to English is Pushkin is everything to us. And it is really so. Any Russian child can recite his poetry by heart. The place is, because Pushkin wrote some fairy tales for the children. And the places we are going to see today are not always in the chronological order. It's because we can see only the sites that are close to where we are now, that stand on the way we are walking. So this is one of the nicest spots of the city. Inside the Winter Palace, and we have just seen it, there is a room which is also associated with Alexander Pushkin. The room is called Gallery of the War of 1812. And it is a very impressive room, one of the most impressive rooms of the Winter Palace. And inside the room, you can see over 300 portraits of Russian generals who were engaged in the war against Napoleon. And already in the 20th century, they sort of engraved Alexander Pushkin's poem dedicated to this room. Once Alexander Pushkin visited the Winter Palace, and he was very much impressed by this room. And now anyone who comes there to this Gallery of the War of 1812 can read his poem there. We are now approaching another interesting part of the city, the Moika River. It is one of the smaller waterways of St. Petersburg. I have to tell you that St. Petersburg is very often called the city of rivers and canals, and it is really so. We used to have more rivers and canals in the past because in the 19th century, 20th century, some small rivers and canals were filled in or taken into tubes. But in the past, we had even more rivers and canals in St. Petersburg. And this is very often why St. Petersburg is called Venice of the North. A lot of rivers and canals here. We're crossing the Moika River. When Alexander Pushkin came to St. Petersburg for the first time, he was only 12 years old. It happened in 1811, when his uncle brought young Alexander to pass the exams for the Tsarskoye Selo Lyceum. We're going to talk about the Lyceum a little later. And they stayed in an inexpensive hotel very close to where we are now. And again, just because of lack of time, we're not going there. It's a regular dwelling house now. It is not used as a hotel anymore, but it is here. So there are hundreds of different buildings in St. Petersburg connected or associated with Alexander Pushkin. He spent 1/3 of his life in St. Petersburg. And the most productive years probably were his last 6 years when he lived in St. Petersburg. And this is where he lived during the last few months of his life. What is interesting, Alexander Pushkin didn't have, or Pushkin family in general, didn't have their private house in St. Petersburg. They always rented apartments in different parts of the city or just stayed in hotels. And we are now approaching one of the most famous buildings also associated with Alexander Pushkin, Moika Embankment number 12. So this is his last house in St. Petersburg. It is very well preserved, and we are going to see the inner courtyard of this house now. Today it is Alexander Pushkin Museum. Here we are. Any Russian at least educated person knows this address. The embankments of the river Moika, number 12. Museum of Alexander Pushkin. There is a nice inner courtyard. It is more or less typical inner courtyard of St. Petersburg of the 19th century. So what you can see here, this is where people would keep wood. Wood was used as a fuel in those days. This is also where they kept horses and carriages. At the other side of the inner courtyard, you can see huge gates. That's where the carriages and the horses were kept. And here also is a monument to Alexander Pushkin, one of many monuments of Alexander Pushkin in this city. He is probably the most revered Russian author. Unfortunately, he lived a very short life. He died at the age of 37. He died here in this building. He was dying for 2 days after the fatal duel, which happened not far from St. Petersburg. Now we can see some slides probably. By the way, this inner courtyard is very often used for poetic recitals. Would you like to show us some views inside the museum? No, that's Lacey. Okay, yes, that's right. So that's where we are. You can see the same building from the outside, and you can see some interiors. In the lower two pictures, you can see the room where Alexander Pushkin was dying. He asked to put a little sofa in his office, and he knew that he was going to die. In the lower picture, you can see the room where he died, and it happened at the end of January. In 1837, he was only 37 years of age. Some of his last words were, he looked around and said, "Farewell, my friends." And by that, he meant books. He looked at the books around. You can see a lot of bookcases there. And he said, "Farewell, my friends."
Live picture.
Okay, yes, you can get back. We can get back to the live picture now. And twice a year, here in the inner courtyard of this building, they organize some kind of poetic recitals on the day when he died and on the day when he was born. You can see there are always fresh flowers here at the foot of the monument. And this museum is always full. You can see a lot of school student groups come here for their tours. So almost all student groups who travel to St. Petersburg visit this museum. Now we can talk a little more about this building, about this museum, and about the duel. Alexander Pushkin rented the second floor of this building because it was not only his family, but also his wife's sister and the servants, of course. By the standards of that time, it was not such a big apartment. His wife, Natalia Goncharova, had the reputation of the first beauty of Russia. And Alexander Pushkin, by the standards of that time, was not considered to be as a handsome man, and he was much lower than Natalia was. And a lot of men, no wonder, envied him. And this was a reason for many gossips and rumors. That's what, of course, Alexander Pushkin didn't like. Apart from that, I have to tell you that Alexander Pushkin himself was a very kind of an unpredictable person. He could not be called a paragon of morality. Today, but he was a genius. And most geniuses are like that. I mean to say that they're not, even being a genius is not always normal. This is something extraordinary. This hot-tempered or short-tempered character of Alexander Pushkin was very often a cause for different scandals. And very few people now know that Alexander Pushkin was involved in 20 different duels. I have to tell you that duels were not allowed. They were against the law, but still they were very common. It was some kind of a code of nobility. If anyone in your family, especially a woman, is insulted, there is no way you can leave it unanswered. You're supposed to initiate a duel against the person who insulted someone from your family. I don't mean to say that all these 20 duels ended up with actual shooting, but sometimes the rules were quite strict. And finally, Alexander was killed in his duel. The duel took place not far from St. Petersburg. There is actually a shot, a video of the place. There is a little obelisk now on the spot where the duel took place. Dmitry, please let us see the monument on the place of his duel. There is an obelisk. At that time, it was a suburb of St. Petersburg. Now it is within the city borders. Alexander Pushkin got an anonymous letter that his wife was dating with another person. Most likely there was nothing behind it. She was very loyal to him. But as a nobleman, he could not leave this letter unanswered, and he initiated the duel. The first who was supposed to shoot was his opponent, and he did shoot and wounded Alexander seriously, but Alexander managed to stand up and shoot back. And it looks like he hit his opponent. His name was Dantes. And but most likely there are different stories. Even there is a story that he had some kind of a metal protection, or the bullet hit the pistol. We don't know how it happened, but the other person wasn't even wounded. And his opponent was a person of dubious origin. He was a foreigner. He had a very dubious reputation. And after Alexander Pushkin died, his body was taken to a church nearby for the funeral service. And this is where the church is. So you can see it now. Let's get back to live picture. Yes, we now came to Horstable Square. And we are just a few steps from Alexander Pushkin's last apartment. And here is a little church where the funeral service took place at night, secretly. Because, why secretly? Because the Tsar was afraid of some kind of unrest. The greatest Russian poet, the victim of different gossips and rumors, was killed by a foreigner of strange origin. And so everything was hushed. And the funeral service was sort of secret at night. And then the body was taken out of St. Petersburg to Alexander Pushkin's family estate, where he is buried. His family estate is not too far from St. Petersburg, and you can also visit it. There is a very interesting museum there, and of course people can see Alexander Pushkin's grave there too. So this is the church where the funeral service of Alexander Pushkin took place. By the way, I would like to tell you something different. You know, we never say Alexander Pushkin in Russian, or we never say Nikolai Gogol in Russian, because we try to sound more respectful about our classical authors, and we would say Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin or Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol. So we always use the patronymic. Patronymic is some kind of a middle name to show our respect. What is interesting, it is not the case with some modern authors and poets, even the writers and poets of the 20th century, usually called by the first name. But about Pushkin, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, we always speak respectfully, and we use always the patronymic. All right, we are now approaching one of the nicest church buildings of St. Petersburg. Although Alexander Pushkin or Gogol couldn't see this building in St. Petersburg because it was built much later. It is one of the nicest church buildings of the city. It is called Church of Savior on the Spilled Blood. It stands right on the spot where one Russian Tsar, his name was Alexander II, was killed by a group of terrorists in 1881. So the church was built as a memorial to the Tsar by his son, Alexander III. And it is one of the nicest church buildings of St. Petersburg, built in the old Russian medieval style. All right, let's move on, please. Now we have some time to talk about first coming of Alexander Pushkin to St. Petersburg when he was only 12 years old, and he came to get into the Lyceum. The Lyceum was opened by the Russian Tsar Alexander I. He decided to educate the young Russian nobles in the liberal European style. And for that purpose, he built a school for boys in very close to his summer residence. The name of the place is Tsarskoye Selo, which can be translated to English as the royal village. And the education
We have some slides.
Oh, yes, that's right. Dmitry, please let us see some slides of the Lyceum. It is also a very interesting museum, and all student groups visit it, of course. So the education was about 6 years. There were 2 classes, each class for 3 years. So the rules were very strict, very prestigious education, and all graduates of the school would usually become prominent people. Many of them became writers, artists, diplomats, and so on, state figures. And Alexander Pushkin was one of them. After the first 3 years of education, all students were supposed to take so-called transfer exam, so that they could be allowed to go on with their education for 3 more years and complete the education there. And here in the picture, next slide, please. There's a famous painting made by Russian artist Ilya Repin. Here you can see Alexander Pushkin at the age of 15 at the transfer exam. And Alexander here is reading his poem, Reminiscences about Tsarskoye Selo. And one of the person who was present at the examination was the most famous poet in Russia at the time, Derzhavin. You can see him on the left side. He was already quite old. He couldn't hear very well. And he was falling asleep all the time. It wasn't so interesting. But when Alexander started reciting his poetry, he woke up, started to listen to the poetry. And then Alexander Pushkin just finished reading his poem. Alexander was so excited. He was reading his poetry to the most famous Russian poet, and he just ran away after he hardly finished it. And Derzhavin started to yell, "Catch him, bring him here. I want to talk to him." And they were trying to find him, but he disappeared. So this is a very famous accident, actually. All right. Now, when we say that Alexander Pushkin is everything to us, we mean, yes, let's get back to the live picture now. We mean different things. When children are little, very little, their parents read fairy tales for them, written by Alexander Pushkin. And you know, there are many quotes that we can use today, and they very often sound like proverbs or sayings, and they got some figurative meaning too. And as we are walking now, you can enjoy the views, but I would like to ask you some questions, if possible, what those quotes actually mean. There is a famous fairy tale about the goldfish, and sometimes a mother or a father can say to a child, "You will remain with the broken trough." Trough is a little wooden kind of tub, or that in villages people use to feed pigs. And what do you think we mean actually? You can remain with a broken trough. It is already figurative meaning, but it is very often used, and any Russian can understand this phrase. Now, what about you? Will you be able to understand what it means? Are you with me?
Guys, say something that you are listening to all that.
Just any guesses?
Yes.
You can remain with a broken trough.
Anybody heard that? Elizabeth, did you hear that?
I don't think so.
No?
All right, let me
Okay,
explain.
I'll say in Russian for Russian speakers, "Остаться у разбитого корыта."
Yes, that's right. It is a very popular phrase, and then your Russian understands what it is. Well, this is a story about an old woman who wanted too much, and finally, when the goldfish executed all her wishes, but she wanted too much, and she stayed, she remained with the broken trough. So we use this phrase. So a mother or a father can say to the child, if you ask too much, or if you are too demanding, you will end up with a broken trough. So that's a very popular phrase. Or when businessmen are discussing their business, and it is a very risky business, they may say, we may remain with a broken trough. So we have to consider all these pros and cons first, and only then decide if we are really going to do it. All right, this is one phrase. In the 6th grade, students here read Alexander Pushkin's story, Dubrovsky. And I remember myself, I use this phrase very often at the age of 12. And it says, "Spokojno, Masha, я Dubrovsky." Any Russian understand it? But it actually, any ideas? Do you have any ideas what it means? Spokojno, Masha, be careful. Oh, no, be quiet, or don't worry, Mary. I'm Dubrovsky. Dubrovsky is the main character of the story. He's a kind of a Robin Hood character, a noble villain. And the phrase actually means, don't worry, I'm not going to do any harm to you. I'm going to protect you if necessary. So this phrase is very often used. Or another phrase from his tragedy, Boris Godunov, "Тяжела ты шапка Мономаха." Monomach, so if you translate it word for word, it actually means the hat of the Prince Monomach is very heavy. And it actually means this is a very hard job for me. I won't be able to do it. It is very often used even when a politician is not good with his work. We can say, so this prince's crown was too heavy for you. You didn't cope with your responsibility, something like that. Or your university professor at the exam can tell you, мы все учились понемногу, чему-нибудь и как-нибудь. If we translate it word for word, we will all learned something, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it actually means you heard something about this subject, but you didn't do it properly. So, you know, such phrases and many other phrases are very often used in our everyday life. And many of his quotes from his poems became like sayings or proverbs. So it became a part, Alexander Pushkin became a part of our everyday life today. We came now to another nice part of the city. Here is one of the nicest palaces of St. Petersburg. Those palaces were built for different noble families and members of the royal family. Right here is Great Duke Michael's palace. Great Duke Michael was the youngest son of the Russian Tsar, Alexander I. And this was his house. But later, another Russian emperor, Alexander III, turned it into a museum of Russian art. That's what it is today. It is the biggest museum of Russian art in the world, 3 million works of art. But the reason why we came here is a monument which stands in the middle of the square. Actually, this is one of the nicest squares of the city. We call it Square of Arts, Площадь искусств, Square of Arts, because there are a few different museums and a few different theaters here. But in the middle of the square is Alexander Pushkin. And this place is quite appropriate for the statue because he lived nearby. He knew this part of the city very well. He liked it. Actually, St. Petersburg was very often a character in the city. You certainly remember the Bronze Horseman poem. Let us please see some verses from the poem. And again, listen to my Russian reciting so that you can hear the melodiousness of his verses. И перед младшей столицей померкла старая Москва, как перед новой царицей парфироносная вдова. And our young capital's aurora put ancient Moscow in the shade, just as a new Tsarina's aura must make the Empress Mother fade. St. Petersburg was growing very fast when Alexander Pushkin is talking about how Peter the Great built the city or was building the city and grew very fast. It was becoming more important and more beautiful than the old Moscow. The next verse, please. The next verse, please. Yes, that's right. This is probably the most famous. Any Russian can recite it by heart. Люблю тебя, Петра творенье, люблю твой строгий, стройный вид, Невы державное течение, береговой ее гранит. I love thee, Peter's grand creation. I love thy aspect fair and chaste, the sovereign Neva's bold progression, her banks with stately granite faced. So again, Alexander Pushkin is a part of our everyday life. When young people decide about a place where to meet, they often choose this place, actually. They just say, let's meet by Alexander Pushkin. And it means here, this place. This is not a very old monument. It was made in 1957. Sculptor Ani Kushin made it. All right, let's move on, please. And now we're coming towards the main.
Show slide with a couple other monuments.
Okay, that's right.
Could
Do
you
we
show
have-
that, Dima? The slide with Pushkin in the metro.
In Lyceum, in the metro, yes, that's right. We have a metro station named after Alexander Pushkin also. Here it is. On the right side is interior of a subway station here. And on the left side is a monument which stands right next to the Lyceum where Pushkin was educated in the town of Tsarskoye Selo. Yes, that's right. So we are now walking towards the main street of the city, Nevsky Prospect. I have to tell you that although people, of course, more often recite his nice verses about St. Petersburg, but St. Petersburg is a big city, and there's everything. Not only the splendor of the royal palaces, the beautiful mansions, but also poor people live here. And certainly Alexander Pushkin also saw the social injustice of the society. One of his poems starts with the verses, "Splendid city, beggared city." So he saw the contrast between the wealth and the poor. And he also fought with injustice. He was suffering from bureaucracy, from those gossips around. He, in order to have access to state archives, for example, he needed to find some compromises with the high society also. By the way, his wife, Natalia Goncharova, they had 4 children. And when Pushkin was dying, he told her that he loved her. And he said that keep mourning for 2 years and marry and remarry. And that's what she did, actually. She married a general, Peter Lanskoy, and she's buried in St. Petersburg in a very famous cemetery, but under the last name of her second husband, Natalia Lanskaya. This cemetery stands at the end of the main street of the city, Nevsky Prospect. But now it's about time to talk about another Russian author, Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol. Actually, when he first came to St. Petersburg, he lived in St. Petersburg for 7 years of his life. St. Petersburg was quite a big disappointment for him. He found it cold, he found it gloomy, and especially he never expected, he was sure that it is a city of beautiful palaces and mansions, bridges and embankments, which was really so. But very soon he also saw the injustice of the world, and the prices were too high. The prices for clothes, he was writing, the prices for food, everything was so expensive. That's what he never expected. And he created sort of a special image of a person who lived in a big city. We call such people маленький человек, which can be translated to English as little person or little man. Gogol wrote a whole series of tales, and he entitled them Petersburgские повести. That's what you know. I know that you read 2 tales, at least, The Overcoat and The Nose. Yes, but one of the tales is entitled Nevsky Prospect, That's where we are now. Nevsky Prospect is the name of the street. Prospect is the Russian word for avenue. Here you can see modern avenue of the Neva, Nevsky Prospect. But now let us see some old views of the street. Yes, that's what the street looked like in Pushkin's and Gogol's times. Of course, it wasn't so busy as it today, but it was still the main street of the city. The novel, Gogol's tale, Nevsky Prospect, starts with the following words: "There is nothing better than Nevsky Prospect," although he then adds, "at least in St. Petersburg."
Next slide, please.
Yes, next slide, please. So you can see some other views. That's a winter view of Nevsky Prospect.
And we have one
Another
more.
one, yes. Thank you. This is Kazan Cathedral, one of the nicest buildings on Nevsky Prospect, and we are going to see this building very soon. So what I was saying, Gogol had sort of mixed feelings about St. Petersburg. To put it plain, he didn't like the city because the city was quite a big disappointment for him due to those also gossips, rumors, necessity to fight for success in a big city. But still, he was a great writer. And he dedicated a lot of his stories to this city. Nevsky Prospect starts at the Admiralty building, built by Peter the Great. Admiralty was a shipyard, and ends up at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, with the famous cemetery where Alexander Pushkin's wife, Natalia, is buried. This is kind of a business center of the city. The city of in the past, in Pushkin's time and Gogol's time, it was the street of the wealth and showing off. So ladies and gentlemen dressed in their best clothes would defilate, would walk along the street to show off very often. But if you just walk a couple of blocks off Nevsky Prospect, you would see poverty, you would see those little people described by Nikolai Gogol. Here is one of the nicest Russian Orthodox churches of the city. It is called Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, Kazan. It was built in 1811. So Alexander Pushkin and Gogol could certainly see it. In a way, this cathedral is also a monument to the Russian victory over Napoleon, because it was built right before the war began. And a famous Russian general, Mikhail Kutuzov, prayed in this church before the most crucial battle of the war, the Battle of Borodino. And the famous icon that Kutuzov prayed to is still there. It can be worshipped. Those Orthodox people can worship this famous icon. All right, but here is a little corner of the United States in St. Petersburg, because it was built for an American, this building at the corner was built for an American company, singular. They used to sell sewing machines there. At the top, you can even see American eagle, and on the breast, there is American flag, stars and stripes. Today, you know, after the Communist Revolution, all these buildings, palaces, private buildings, they were all nationalized, confiscated from the previous owners. And this building, for example, became a bookstore, and that's what it is today. We have just crossed another small waterway of the city. This one is called the Griboyedov Canal. It is named after another Russian poet, also Alexander Sergeyevich Griboyedov. Vita Woe is his most famous poem. So here you can see the nice building. We still call it Singer Building, although they don't sell sewing machines here anymore. Okay, we've got just about 10 minutes left, and we are now approaching a monument to Nikolai Gogol. Also stands right of Nevsky, the part of the city that he liked, and the part of the street which became a character of some of his works, including his short novel, short story actually, Nevsky Prospect. This is also a very recent monument. It was made in the early 1990s. Quite an interesting statue. People are trying to see some secret meaning of the statue. For example, when we get closer to the statue, you can see that Nikolai Gogol is not looking at the city, he's looking down, which probably means that he didn't like the city. That's one of the explanations of the city. Or there's another explanation. He's looking at the passers-by, simple people, ordinary little people who became characters of his novel, of his books. One of the most mystic Russian authors.
And we have a picture of nose.
Yes, in St. Petersburg, we have monuments not only to the authors, but we have monuments to different literary characters. And we have 3 monuments to the nose. Let us see at least one of them. Dmitry, please let us see. Aha, here it is. It is on Вознесенский Prospect. And that's where the nose, you remember the story about the nose of Major Kovalev, who decided to wander by itself. And very often the nose could be seen there. And that's why when they were thinking about a place for the monument, they chose it there. But we have 2 other versions of this monument in some other parts of the city. We are back on Nevsky Prospect. We still have just one more spot to stop at, but if you have any questions at this point, I would be glad to answer. You can see it's a very busy street. You can find just anything on Nevsky, all kinds of cafes, shops, theaters, movie theaters, expensive restaurants, expensive hotels. It is still the kind of wealthier part of the city. It is not so inexpensive or so cheap to live in the city center. Of course, housing here and rent here is very high. There's a nice church here of St. Peter's. It's a Lutheran church. St. Petersburg was a capital city of the country, and it was a city of people of different religions. And that's why even in Nevsky Prospect, we have churches of different congregations. Also, this was the wealthiest part of the city, and some most beautiful palaces are also standing here. For example, we are approaching a palace of the Stroganov family. Stroganovs, you remember, there is a food famous all over the world, beef stroganoff. It is named after this family who were great gourmets of food. Live musicians. Evening is coming. There'll be even more street musicians later here.
Спасибо.
Today, the Stroganov Palace is a museum and can be visited. You can see beautiful interiors of the palace, and they will tell you about the family also. One of the richest families, Catherine the Great, had a good sense of humor. And once she was introducing Count Stroganov to the Austrian ambassador, sorry, to the Austrian emperor here, and she did it the following way. This is Count Stroganov. What can I tell you about him? He tries to go bankrupt very hard and fails each time. So this family was so rich, they could not go bankrupt. They had a few different palaces in St. Petersburg. So very often St. Petersburg is called the city of palaces, which is really so. And this part of the city is a concentration of such beautiful palaces. And we are now approaching another important site. Today, the name of the place is Literaturное Café, which can be translated to English as literary cafe. But in Alexander Pushkin and Gogol's time, it was called Wolf and Berenger. Dmitry, please let us see the picture of the cafe, what it looked like back then. Here it is. This building is right in front of us now. Would you like, please let us see the interiors of the cafe today. They're trying to keep those literary traditions. Yes. Another picture. This was a favorite place of Alexander Pushkin. And this was the last place he visited before the duel. So here you can see that, back to life picture, please. Yes, here you can see a painting showing Alexander and his wife. So see, he was shorter, 14 centimeters, they even calculated. He was 14 centimeters shorter than she was. Okay, and they are trying to keep those poetic traditions here. And inside the cafe, you can still see Alexander Pushkin. Here he is. Of course, you understand, it's a wax figure of Alexander Pushkin. He's sitting there and working on a piece of poetry. All right. So that's probably what I wanted to tell you about Alexander Pushkin and Gogol. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to see a lot because we're pretty short on time. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer.
Okay, time for questions. Are you there? Hurry up.
You can ask about anything, not just about Pushkin or Gogol. Actually, next time we're going to talk about the most famous St. Petersburg writer, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. And we're going to be in a totally different part of the city, which we still call Dostoevsky's St. Petersburg. It is not going to be the city of wealth, the city of the imperial family, but it is going to be a city of the poor, common people whose lives were described in Dostoevsky's novels. But that's going to be next time.
All right, so anybody has a question?
You can ask about anything. Maybe you saw something unusual or something strange would look sort of unusual to you, because we want you to get a better idea of this place.
I have a question. It's not
Yes, please.
about what we saw. It's just a separate question.
Mhm.
St. Petersburg is it looks very, very beautiful and really well decorated. And I'm wondering, is it an affordable city to live in? Or because I'm from New York City, so for me, like that's expensive. So how does St.
Well,
Petersburg compare?
I guess St. Petersburg is less expensive than New York, less expensive than Moscow, but by Russian standards, it is quite expensive. Cost of life here is quite high. That's true. It is a very popular city. A lot of people from all over Russia come here, especially young people, and they want to stay here. The population of the city today is 5,600,000 people. And cities like St. Petersburg and like Moscow also, they offer more job opportunities for the young people. So a lot of young people from all over the country come here to live and stay and work. But cost of life here is quite high. That's true.
Okay.
Oh, thank
Anybody
you.
else?
Yes?
Anybody else? Yes, no?
Sure, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, like, what's the Winter Palace used for today? Now that, there's no czars or anything.
That's right. The Winter Palace is a part of the biggest art museum in the world, biggest in the terms of number of artworks. It is an art museum. The name of the museum is Hermitage, and it occupies a few different buildings, including the Winter Palace. So at the Hermitage, you can see beautiful artworks, Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, El Greco, biggest collection of the French Impressionists, etc., etc. But you can also see the beautiful interiors of the Winter Palace, like state quarters of the royal family, private quarters of the royal family, the throne room, the ballrooms, etc., etc. This is the most important place to visit in St. Petersburg for sure, the Hermitage. And part of it is the Winter Palace.
Okay. Anybody else? One more question and maybe that's it.
All right, then. We were glad that you found time to stay with us today. So our operator was Elena. The moderator was Dmitry, helping us with this tour. So thank you for staying with us. Here we are.
Well, thank you so much. I think it was perfect in terms of combination of slides and a live,
Right. Sorry,
stories.
it was a little bit in a hurry. We wanted you to see as much as possible.
Yes, thank you so much. And we look forward to Dostoevsky that we will start next week. We will start Notes from the Underground, Zapiski из подполья. So
Okay.
I
Oh,
think
that's a
that
very serious piece. Yes.
okay. Well, thank you again, Dmitry,
Welcome.
Elena, Sergey. Sergey, you are amazing, I think. The fact that you walk, talk, and do it so fast, it's great, really. Okay, so are we saying thank you?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
And thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you very much. Bye.